understand, it helps us understand the hatred that you see with Jonah, why Jonah would be the way he is.
Right.
Yeah. But you see both God's mercy in terms of Jonah, that he's willing to spare repentant people, but the reality is that Nineveh doesn't stay that way, and they're the agents of evil. All right, we're going to look at Nahum and from it expand on the whole idea of the persecution of God's people today. All right. This shit's supposed to advance. Boy. I don't know what's going on
Oh,
here.
somebody is back right now if you want to.
Oh, that's why. Are you recording this now? Yes. Okay, I didn't know that. I didn't see it. Okay. All right, we're looking at Nineveh and Nahum's prophecy against it, and we'll look at persecution in our world today. Norm, I need to advance it. My remote is not working.
Try it again.
Now it's working. Okay, why was Assyria so feared? We've gotten some of the details in the sermon to expand on that though a little bit. Typical of their art, they love to show their soldiers. And you see this, further examples of it. There's where they take the skulls and they make the mounds out of them. What was the reaction of people to the Assyrians?
Don't want no part of that.
They didn't.
No.
And if they were, what was their reaction? They were hatred, but nevertheless fear. You know, you think of Nazi Germany at the end. If you look at World War I and World War II, what happened to Germany in World War I? Why did the war end? Did the Allies conquer Germany? No, they didn't. Germany collapsed from within and said we want an armistice. The Kaiser abdicated. It was internal. Really, none of Germany had been fought over. None of their towns or any places. They lost a lot of men, but none of their land was ravaged. But in World War II, what happens to Germany at the end?
Well, especially by the Russians, they get.
Wasn't just the Russians. What happened to virtually every town in Germany, even before the Russians came?
Leveled.
They're leveled by our bombers. Yeah. And the whole country had to be conquered. Why? There was no overthrow from within. Why? Because Adolf Hitler was so feared. They tried to, but they couldn't. And at the end, the Germans weren't fighting because they wanted to, they really believed that Hitler was going to win. They were just so afraid that they didn't bother trying to rebel. That even though everything had collapsed all around, all their cities are bombed out, they still, because of their fear of Hitler and the Nazis, did not surrender. Now Jonah, remember, why did he want to go to Nineveh? And why did he sulk when God spared them? This helps explain it. You know, you might think he didn't want to go because he was afraid. But he tells us, no, it wasn't because he was afraid. What he was afraid of is that God would spare them. That's how hated they were. And that's why he sulks when God spares them. You know, the famous story where there's well, before that there's a kind of a bush that gives them shade. God sends the caterpillar or the worm to destroy, and he's more saddened by that, God says, than the possible loss of the people of Nineveh. Okay? So, although the Assyrians were a very vivid example of what threatened Israel, what other nations persecuted them? Well, we'll list some of them. Egypt. Remember what happened to the people of Israel with Egypt?
Totally enslaved.
They were enslaved by the Pharaoh, the descendants of Jacob. Philistia. The Philistines, when do you hear about them? When the people of Israel...
Well, they won enough of a battle, they actually took the...
Ark, yeah. Yeah. When the people of Israel, after the Exodus under Joshua, go into the Promised Land, that's when they first encounter the Philistines. And so from that period on, all until David finally conquers them, for that whole period, they're a constant threat to the people of Israel. Babylon. Well, remember, Assyria conquers the northern kingdom. It's Babylon who conquers the kingdom of Judah and takes people into exile. The Greeks, they were actually the first to persecute their religion. The others would add their god to their gods and tell people you need to worship their gods. But the Greeks actually were the first to intentionally persecute the Old Testament faith. And then Rome, who's in control when Jesus comes. Who first persecuted the Christians? Acts 7, the story of Stephen.
Jews.
Jews, yes. Who later who did it, as we read about in 1 Peter. Who did it later? It was people, not any kind of a government thing, but people who didn't like the culture of Christians because they didn't fit in with others. In what way would Christians not fit in with others? They weren't involved, especially in their worship of gods. Now, if you lived in Rome, the Roman world at the time of Jesus, the worship of the gods was a public thing. And to do that was not just simply a religious duty, it was a civic duty. You know, you were to show up at a festival for a god like we show up for a 4th of July parade. So if you didn't participate, you were suspect in terms of your patriotism, in terms of your loyalty. And so this happened first before there was official persecution of Christians. And when did that become official? Near the end of the 100s. You have these periods of times where it's officially persecuted by the Romans. First, it's kind of certain territories, but then later it becomes empire-wide. Now, at first, Christianity is spared from Roman persecution because Christians were seen as what religious group? They were seen as a sect or a branch of what? Jewish. They were a part of the Jewish faith, which was a legal religion in the Roman Empire. But after the fall of Jerusalem and the decline of that Jewish worship, and the fact that now more and more of the converts to Christianity were not Jews but Gentiles, they ended up having a separate identity and not falling under that protection. And that's when they became officially persecuted. Okay, how did Christianity become legal then? Well, the Romans start persecuting around 100 AD, up until like 330 AD, they're persecuting until what?
Constantine?
Yes, right. This is the symbol of Constantine. Supposedly saw a vision that said, by this sign conquer, and he saw a cross.
Not at all.
So he defeated his enemy and allowed Christianity, first of all, to become legal, and later on made it the main religion of the Roman Empire. Okay? There's Constantine and his Edict Milan, which legalized Christianity. All right? Now, where did Christianity face persecution as it expanded into the world? Think about it. Well, first with the Romans, but then as it got into areas where the Germanic tribes came, and the Germanic tribes began to overrun the Roman Empire. It's persecuted there. You first were the Greeks, and then later as the Slavic people in Eastern Europe came in. We think of the Saxons and the Danish. Because what happened is you had Christianity going to England, and most of England is Roman Christian. Then the Saxons come and invade their Germanic tribe and becomes pagan again. And then missionaries both from the continent and from Scotland and Ireland who retained Christianity re-evangelize the Saxons, become Christians. Then the Scandinavians and the Danes raid them, threaten their faith until they become Christian. So you had opposition in those times. And then starting in the 600s, you have opposition from Islam, and how Christianity became very much, had problems with that. But even though there was Muslim persecution, it was held back compared to the persecution of pagans. If you're a pagan, you convert, or you had your head chopped off. But the Quran says that when you encounter Jews and Christians, you encourage them to convert, but you allow them because they're people of the book. So Christians and Jews were allowed to continue to live in the Muslim world, though they had to pay special taxes, though they were encouraged to become Muslim, but there were still places in the Muslim world that had substantial amounts of Christians and Jews. And later, this was all organized under the Ottoman Turkish rule, which really controlled the Middle East from about the year 1400 until the 20th century. All right? Now, there was persecution of Orthodox and Catholic Christian, Eastern and Western Christians by each other, and later persecution of Protestants by Catholics, and vice versa. Or would there have been a vice versa? Where were Catholics persecuted by Protestants? Pardon? Excuse me?
Northern Ireland?
Well, yeah, Northern Ireland, but also England itself. And also the United States. In the 1800s, Catholics were persecuted because they were Catholic in a Protestant nation. The Ku Klux Klan had three enemies: African Americans, Jews, and Roman Catholics. It was death sentence as a politician to be associated as a Catholic. It didn't mean much to us today, but in the 1960 election, who was running for president that made that caused a lot of questions? John Kennedy, who was a Catholic. And people were saying, can a Catholic be a president? Not an issue today, but in those times it was. Okay. But do we think of ourselves today as being persecuted? Like the Assyrians, in a sense, threatened God's people, Israel. Do we? Do we have to worry that we can't go to church and worship in public with other Christians?
Some places.
But we here, no. We just had a memorial service for Jane Frericks. When Jane lived in Saudi Arabia for several years, what did it take for her to practice her Christian faith?
You know, she wore a head.
Yeah, she had to do that. That was a cultural thing, but in terms of practicing the Christian faith, they had to meet in homes, and not only they had to meet in homes, but they had to limit their number and keep it very quiet, because if there were too many of them, the government would come in, and since they're Americans, they wouldn't hurt them, they would deport them. You had to keep it totally secret, totally quiet. You know? Why did 9/11 take place? Because American troops went into Saudi Arabia, and according to the extreme Islamists, they polluted the holy sacred land of Saudi Arabia. Even though they kept in their compounds, within those compounds you had Christian worship, for instance, Jewish worship take place. And it was in response to that, these extreme Muslims said, we've got to put an end to that evil. How about in the world? Well, what we're going to look at today is world persecution. You can get on the internet, there are all kinds of sites of Christians who keep watch over what's going on with this. All right? Here is the first country we'll look at. This is Somalia, the Horn of Africa. All right? Somebody will read here about what it says about persecution among Christians in Somalia.
Christians in Somalia face extreme persecution. They are explicitly targeted by the terrorist Islamic group Al-Shabaab.
Very good.
Are frequently killed immediately upon discovery. Even being suspected of having converted to Christianity even being suspected of having been converted to Christianity can greatly endanger one's life.
Okay.
Anyone found in possession of any Christian materials, including the Bible, is executed, often with the blessing of their family and community.
Okay, next country on the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula is Yemen. Somebody read this one.
In the midst of war and strife, Christians in Yemen are increasingly facing violent attacks and lengthy incarceration. Converts to Christianity are even more vulnerable to physical and mental abuse, sexual assault, rape, forced marriage, and honor killings.
Okay, next country, Libya.
Libya has no functioning government and is primarily run by Islamist terrorist organizations, organized crime groups, and drug cartels. Christians are targeted for kidnap, rape, slavery, and extrajudicial killings. These crimes are perpetrated with complete impunity. Christians who convert from Islam are routinely killed by their own families as a matter of honor. Or Christians...
Okay, this is in fact, more guy mentioned this from when Christians lost their life in the 20th century than all other centuries before then combined. Nigeria. Nigerian Christians face violence from the Fulani militants in the Middle Belt, Boko Haram and ISWAP in the north, and bandits throughout the border regions. This year, terrorist attacks happened as far south as the Ondo state, with 41 Christians murdered in one church on Pentecost Sunday. Pakistan. Anybody read this?
Apart from Nigeria, Pakistan is the only country awarded the maximum violence score by the Open Doors World Watch list. Christian women and girls are still regularly targeted for abduction, rape, and forced conversion. The country's infamous blasphemy laws remain a constant threat to Pakistan's beleaguered Christian community. All Christians suffer institutional discrimination.
I don't know if any of you remember from our international ministry, we had a family from Pakistan, Christian Pakistans, and how difficult it was for them, and they had to return, and how difficult it still is for them. Iran. Anybody read?
Violent attacks and abductions targeted at Iranian Christians have increased this year. Converts face extreme hostility from their families and communities, and pastors are regularly arrested, persecuted, and given lengthy prison sentences for crimes against national security.
All right. Afghanistan.
Afghanistan remains a brutal place for Christians to live. It has dropped significantly in the World Watch list, right consulting to the fact that many Christians were forced to flee in the wake of the Taliban's takeover last year.
Excuse me?
Christians converts remain in great danger in Afghanistan, and their mere existence implies that they live in deep hiding.
All right, next, Sudan, North Sudan. You see the kind of the curvy thing. South Sudan is more Christian. Somebody read?
Last year, Sudan dropped in the World Watch list after the fall of the al-Bashir government and some positive legislation changes. Current authorities are now, however, forcibly closing churches and arresting pastors, and it is clear that extremist rule has returned. In addition, the integration of local community police forces and the continued presence of our militia and terrorist groups means that Christians remain under the constant threat of violence.
Now, all these countries I've listed for are Muslim dominated, but they do show that that is a problem. Any country that has a Muslim majority in this world persecutes other religions. You know, we hear in this country from Muslims how they agree with us in our understanding of the freedom of religion, separation of church and state. But where Muslims dominate, there is always a sense that they dominate. They dominate the political thing, and they limit worship from other religions.
Pastor Mark?
Yes?
Do any of our international visitors that, participate here feel that persecution when they go return?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. I mentioned in the sermon, you weren't here then, but a few weeks ago we had this young woman from China play the violin with Carol Weber. She and her family became Christian when they were in Milwaukee with her dad doing postgraduate work. They returned back to China and they cannot worship freely. It means so much for her personally to be able to worship here. On Monday, a pastor from Taiwan, Michael Paul, and his wife were here along with one of the Taiwanese national pastors. And Michael Paul's wife is Taiwanese, and she's the sister of, those of you who were here the Wednesday before, she's the sister of Chency Hansen, Carl Hansen's wife. And they were talking with her, and Pastor Paul is part of a mission society that has set up a website that you can get religious services, Christian services in China, because normally what we do, you can't do in China what we do here because YouTube shut down. You can't watch church services from away. You just can't do that. And this is one way they can get around it. Hopefully her family back in China will be able to at least see a worship service. So, yeah, we do have it. And, just looking at some of the nations here, we have had students, of course, from Sudan, not just from South Sudan. We've had students from Afghanistan, certainly from Iran, Pakistan, Nigeria. I don't know about Libya or Yemen, Somalia. Yeah, we've had people from all these areas. And yes, those as Christians will tell you this is very, very real. All right. Now let's look at some other examples of non-Muslim dominated persecution of Christians. And as we do this, we remember this statement from St. Paul in Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against authorities are rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers owe no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for the rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servant, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Now, why would Christians like Paul emphasize this attitude toward the government? Understand, the government at this time was Caesar and the Romans, and they were pagan. Why would he have that attitude?
You have a guest after.
Oh, yeah. No problem. Yeah, why would he have that attitude?
Well, he was on the other side at one time, so he knows exactly the thought's still out there.
Oh, all right. What do you mean by the other side?
Well, I was thinking as a Roman citizen that.
Oh, he's still a Roman citizen, yeah, but he wasn't certainly in favor of Rome in terms of its religion. He was an extreme Jew. He did not like Roman persecution, Roman paganism. But he understands Christians are this tiny little group, and if they get involved in the politics of Rome, they'll be stamped out. And he's shown you don't have to fight Rome to maintain your faith. You work and operate under the government. And remember, how did Paul make use of Rome and the Roman citizenship in his ministry?
Well, he had knowledge of their outdoor discussion areas, courts almost, if you will, and he knew how those operated, and he went right in there.
Yeah. And also there were times where he faced rough treatment, and he was spared because of his Roman citizenship. Or think of the situation in Philippi where he's jailed, and then after the fact, they find out that he's a Roman citizen and being incarcerated without a trial, which was illegal. They try to hush it up. Or when he is facing persecution from the Jews in Jerusalem, he falls under Roman protection. It's the Roman civil government that protects him from being killed by his Jewish enemies. This helps the spread of Christianity because not only are they not persecuted, but they use the Roman system, which says, cooperate with the government, work with the government, and it'll benefit people. And that's really what we can see in most cases, is that when Christians are loyal citizens and obey their government, it really helps the spread of Christianity. An example of this would be Ethiopia, where our friend Kebeta lived. Ethiopia's in the 1970s, what ruled Ethiopia? Or how was Ethiopia ruled? How was it ruled? Who was in charge? A guy by the name of Mengistu, who was a hardline communist. They make an alliance with the Soviet Union, very hardline. And during that time, all religions were persecuted, not just Christians, Muslims, but the group that in the midst of that persecution came out well was the Protestants, especially the Lutherans, because even though you had this atheistic government, they still were good citizens. They still didn't fight, and they gained the favor of the government and of other groups, and it caused great growth in the Lutheran Church, but also they became a peacekeeping group among all the other groups and gained a good reputation. One of the things that continues, as we see with the work of Kebeta, is that they're seen in good graces by the government. The government in Ethiopia doesn't favor any religion, but they still like the Lutheran Church there because they're good as citizens. Now, Kebeta started these projects of reforestation, and at first it was done with the church's money and church volunteers, and they became so good at it, the government said, hey, show us how to do this. Now, they're not doing it so much, the government's doing it, but the government appreciated how they showed them how to do it. So they have a good reputation with the government, and this helps to spread the Christian faith. In Genesis 1, we realize that God created order out of chaos. The earth was without form and void, but then God said, let there be. And God is a God of order, and that's why God wants us to obey the government, to keep things orderly. This is the church at Awassa, recently built, where Kebeta and his family worship. It's designed to look like the Ark, all right? But they're able to do this because they do work with the government, all right? In terms of persecution with the Muslims, this happened especially, it's gotten worse because the failure to succeed at socialism, capitalism. The Arabs became very socialistic in the 60s, 70s. Remember who the big Arab leader was at that time? No. Nasser of Egypt. He was their big leader. He was not an avid Muslim. He was a socialist. And remember, his government was supported by the Soviet Union. He was so good at it that Egypt and Syria were not a separate nation. They became a combined nation called the United Arab Republic. But this failed them. Classic example is in Egypt. You know what the famous dam is there? Was there? They built this dam along the Nile River. Yes, and the Soviets funded it. What happened as a result of that massive project? It stopped the natural flooding of the Nile. And as a result of that, parasites that were held in check by that grew like crazy. It devastated Egyptian agriculture. So as a result of that, the Arabs said they didn't want to go socialist. So they turned to the United States, because the United States could, the United States, if you wanted to rebel, if you wanted to fight, go to the Soviet Union. They were good at providing weapons and that kind of thing. But if you wanted to grow economically, the United States. So they went with the United States, because after Nasser, it's Sadat, who's pro-US. But then what happens? It didn't work for them. They couldn't compete in the capitalist world. So what has happened now is that the Muslims have said, we need to restore what was our glory days in the Middle Ages, not by going socialist or capitalist, but going back to the old Islamic ways. All right? And going back to prior to World War I, where the Ottomans did have control, and they were connected. The emperor of the Ottomans was also tied into being the head of the religion of Islam. And after World War I, the European nations came in and just basically made all these artificial nations, and it's wrecked the world since that time. So that's really exacerbated Muslim persecution, because if you look at what it was like before World War I with the Ottomans, Christians did exist under them, and there were substantial amounts of Christians in the Middle East. Take Iraq. There was what's called the Chaldean Christian Church, huge amounts of Christians, places like that, Pakistan. And as a result of this rise in Muslim extremists, it's gotten really difficult for those people. Nepal, country in the Himalaya Mountains, it is not Muslim. What's the official religion of Nepal? Anybody know? Hinduism. So extreme you can't be anything else. If you know you're something other than a Hindu, they will deport you. Yet we've had contact over here in the United States with Nepalese people. We can't go over there to evangelize them, but we are able to do it here. This area of India, called Manipur. During World War II, this was well known to the United States, because what happened here is this was the area where they built the airfields to fly the hump, as they called it, over the Himalayas to China. And there was a lot, because of the Westerners, and there was a lot of Christian influence in this area, a lot of Christian churches. But somebody read what's going on in the Manipur state. On May 3, tensions between the Kuku tribe, who are majority Christian, and the majority Hindu Meitei people of Manipur State, northwest India, escalated into violence. All right? And here you see this area was built up during World War II. And they used this because this was the area of India that was closest to Burma, and that way to get into China. The building of the Burma Road, for instance, which supplied our supplies to China. The community-wide rioting led to the burning of more than 200 churches and the death of more than 60 believers. Tensions have been brewing between these two groups for decades. But the root of most of the violence was Manipur's pro-Hindu government deciding to give the Meitei people additional land and benefits. Combined with the eviction of the Christian Kukis from their ancestral land, the Kuki tribe protested these actions, and the protests led to the violence. All right? Here's another example of a non-Muslim country which faces extreme persecution. Anybody know what this is? North Korea. Kim Jong-un is the third ruler of North Korea who has come from the Kim dynasty. His father, Kim Jong-il, led North Korea from 1994 to 2011. And Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, founded the modern North Korea in 1948 and built a culture of personality around the Kim family during his nearly 60-year rule. But it might surprise you to learn that this part of the Korean peninsula hasn't always been known for brutality toward Christians. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Christianity flourished. In the first half of the 20th century, it was even called the Jerusalem of the East. After World War II, Korea was split in two. The north was occupied by the Soviet Union, and the south was occupied by Western allies. Eventually, this led to the creation of a two-nation peninsula that continues: a communist north ruled by the Kim family, and a democratic south that is allied with the West. When Kim Il-sung took control of North Korea in 1948, he came with a surprising background. Both of his parents were believed to be Christians. His mother was a Presbyterian deaconess, and Kim Il-sung was actually attended a Christian school where he played the organ. Yet when Kim began to rule, the persecuted Christians began immediately and brutally. Many North Korean priests were executed, and those Protestant leaders who didn't flee to the south were executed or forced into the lowest social status. Most Christians who were able to so fled to South Korea during the beginning of the Kim dynasty. Ever since, the persecution of Christians in North Korea has continued. The brutality is astonishing, with Bible distribution leading to public execution and horrific imprisonments in North Korea's sadistic system of labor camps. Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un intensified the persecution of Christians with stricter border controls, and more spies were dispatched to China to infiltrate the network of missionaries. The regime conducted more random house searches and issued heavier punishments. China. The Chinese Communist Party is extending its repression of Christians and surveillance, censorship, and disinformation, using technology to control and coerce behavior throughout its social credit system. Through economic and political influence, China is also becoming an incubator and legitimizer of persecution around the world. As China exports its invasive technology, it is de facto exporting its authoritarian ideology. All right. Now, China does have a fair amount of Christians. China was a big target for Western evangelism in the 1800s and early 1900s. Thousands upon thousands of missionaries in China. But what happened to them in 1949? They all had to leave as the communists took over. And there was estimated to be about 5 million Christians in China with all those workers that had to leave. Well, from that time until the 1980s, China was closed to the rest of the world. In the early 70s, Nixon went there, but still was closed until the 80s when things started to open up. And what we discovered is that the Chinese church, without these missionaries, grew from 5 to 50 million. But still, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of China. But the other thing is what the Chinese Christian church is. Officially, the communist government does not object to Chinese Christians. They say what they object to is any kind of foreign influence. Any kind of foreign influence. As long as you can keep it purely Chinese, it's okay to be a Christian. But what's resulted in that is that the Chinese Christian churches reflect that kind of authoritativeness. And what will happen is we'll have Chinese come over to this country, convert to Christianity. Then they go back to China, and they go to these churches, and it's not what they heard. There's no gospel. They feel alienated. Pastor Hansen told us about they started a church in mainland China, and the government allowed it because it is a church for people who are from other countries, and they have service in English. But there are lots of Chinese that became Christian in the United States or other Western countries who go to that church, because that's like the Christianity that they learned when they first became Christian. But there's only a few sites like that, so it's very, very difficult for Christians in China. Mexico. What? Isn't Mexico Roman Catholic? Well, there's an estimated 150 organized crime gangs in Mexico financed by powerful drug cartels. Christians living in territories risk being targeted. Christian leaders in particular can be viewed as a threat or a defiant to the gang's authority and stability. When Christians refuse to carry out a gang's demand or speak out against the crimes, their church is soon in the firing line. The impunity and political instability contribute to the lack of justice, where several pastors and priests have been kidnapped and held to ransom, badly beaten, or killed. The gangs, as de facto authorities in most neglected areas, also give fines and extort money from church leaders, believing they must have access to some church funds. These illegal groups have diversified and strengthened their networks across the whole country. So Christian leaders, especially those carrying out activities as human rights or environmental defenders, are at high risk of death, recruitment, sexual harassment, adoption, forced displacement, as well as other forms of violence. The relatives are also at risk. In rural areas, new Christian believers who come from more ancestral and traditional backgrounds, mostly beliefs related to the Roman Catholic faith, can be beaten, fined, harassed, and denied use of public services, rejected and forced to be displaced by their communities. Mostly beliefs related to the Roman Catholic faith can be beaten, fined, harassed, denied use of public services. In general, intolerance and scrutiny of Christians speaking out on social issues is increasing as Mexico becomes radically secular. Mexico, nominally Christian, and yet, if you're Christian and you speak out as a Christian against these things, you're going to be in trouble. Okay, what can we do about this? Well, number one, pray. Hebrews reminds Christians, continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and as those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. So we should be continuing to praying for our brothers and sisters who face persecution. To keep informed, so often our media only covers what's newsworthy. All right? It's certain issues that'll be brought up, but other things, we hear about violence all the time, the war in Ukraine. We don't hear a lot from Africa where there's horrible violence and stuff. That doesn't seem as newsworthy. 3, support mission efforts. One thing our mission efforts are good at is following the guidelines of the State Departments and foreign governments, which really reduces a lot of the persecution. Some of the persecution is caused not because the governments are evil, whatever, but because sometimes you have Christian groups that use their freedom in the gospel to not obey, to be arrogant, and actually build obstacles. And because they have this understanding that since they're working for God, they can believe whatever they want. There can be groups who are less patient and cause persecution by their lack of respects. 4, advocacy. Work with those who care about the rights of others, even if people defend the rights of those who do immoral things. The way those are fought is spiritually, not by force. So you will have groups that will advocate for those who are being persecuted, not so much on a faith, spiritual background, but they're just against mistreatment of people, human rights of people. And those are groups that we can work with politically when they say, we can't, we need to defend the dignity of human beings and human rights, and we can work with them in that area, even though we disagree with other things that they believe. Because so many other things that we have conflict with them about, things like sexual identity, are not things that we're going to fight by political force, but by spirituality, by our Christian faith. That the only way those people really understand and live by Christian principles is if they become Christians themselves. But we can work together with them. One example I could think of is we had a Chinese woman, when they had the strict policy of the Chinese government, you only allowed to have one child. Well, she had a child, and she got pregnant here. And there was concern that if she went back, she would only be allowed back if she aborted that child. Well, there's an example where you could get both the pro-life and the pro-choice people together. Because what would pro-choice say about something like that? What would pro-choice people say? It's your choice. And they would defend a woman on that level. That's an area where you could work together, because that's an area where they would both agree that whether it's the mother's decision or the rights of the child, they're one and the same in that situation. So those are cases where we can work together with those groups and try to help with that, especially when we're dealing on a political level. All right, so those are things that we can do, and we want to be active in that role because it's often not a part of our everyday life, but it is for a lot of people in the world who are Christians. Comments, thoughts?
I guess it's good that we have an international ministry.
It does. It helps keep us aware of that, and we find that out. We deal with people who come from countries where they couldn't be a Christian openly, things like that.
Ever since though, when you know, in a group that they're afraid or they're not giving off that kind of a vibe to us.
Oh, it depends. It depends. Yeah, some are, some aren't, but it depends. Yeah, what's helped is that the fact that among internationals, churches have a great reputation. And the reason for that is because originally the universities were very reluctant to work with churches because they feared proselytizing. But when budget cuts came around, the international offices said, we need to do a lot of this stuff through volunteers. What's their number one source of volunteers? Churches. And the people in the churches who do this have learned to be respectful and to operate under the government's principles. For instance, if you're going to work with the university, then you have to abide by the university's values, and they'll say things, agree to things that we know are immoral. But we won't openly criticize that because that's a matter of spiritual thing. So we'll work properly with them in the areas that we can of being helpful to people from other countries. And recognize that we're not going to stop those immoral things among the people we work with through force, through political means, but through the gospel. These people will then come to faith and want to be that way. So that's really been important, and we're made aware of that through working with these groups and these people of what's going on in the world. I'll give an example too of that too. When we first encountered Chinese students in the 1980s, they were always looking over their shoulders. You couldn't make real deep friendships with them because they're afraid. But it opened up. And also the ones that we first met had experienced things like the Cultural Revolution. Whereas the newer generations, they didn't understand, they didn't have that same kind of strict government, and so they're more open about things. So you'll see it in various degrees.
Only classes this past year taught by Chinese, and they've been here a long time.
Yeah.
But they were very cautious about letting any of the lectures that they were giving be put out for us to watch later.
Yeah.
And the reason was they had to go back through and check out what they had said because they were looked over their shoulder.
Yeah.
There were Chinese watching them all the time,
Yeah.
even though they hadn't been back in their own country for a long time. And I read, after I was astounded when I saw that, and then I read later that there were like 10,000 Chinese professional people here who had disappeared in the last couple of years, and they don't know what happened to them. And it's because of this, that's the reason they are the way they are. What a horrible way to have to live, to look over your shoulder
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
So it isn't just the church, but it just has expanded from, I guess they're afraid of what they're going to learn or
Yeah.
with, or that they think, or I don't know,
But despite that, the gospel still is being spread. Just found out recently, what is the fastest by nation? The fastest growing Christian church is in what country? By percentages, not by number, but percentage of growth. What country? What? What do you say?
Country girls.
Not in Africa. You would think it would be in Africa.
Iran?
Iran. Where lots, and of course where it first started is that people in the Middle East, places like Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, they need jobs. Well, if you're in Mexico, you go to the United States. If you're in those countries, where do you go? Germany. Because the Germans are like the Americans. They don't want to do any of the dirty work. So here in this country, the Mexicans have to do it. Well, in Germany, it's people from the Middle East. And as they did this, they became exposed to Christianity. And the Ringleys will tell you, they went to a church in Berlin, Lutheran church. What was the dominant language there besides German? Parsi, the language of the Iranians. And everybody at church pretty much were people from the Middle East. So yeah, Iran, fastest growing Christian church in the world, even with the extreme Islam there. So God's work. Yeah, definitely. All right, well, let's close with prayer. Dear Lord, we pray for those who are truly persecuted, who truly have to make life and decisions every day to follow you. We ask that you give them strength to continue in your faith, and we ask that through many different efforts that their governments, their societies change and allow religious liberty so that they can freely worship you as we do. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Next week, Obadiah, who is similar to Nahum in his that he's railing against a nation, but what's different is instead of a totally out pagan nation like Assyria, it's Edom, which is the descendants of Esau, therefore the Israelites' relatives.